The Montana sun beat down mercilessly on the dirt road leading into Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows between the scattered pines that dotted the landscape. Thomas Whitmore guided his wagon slowly, the wheels creaking under the weight of freshly cut timber. Sweat trickled down his weathered face as he squinted against the afternoon glare, eager to reach town before the general store closed. At 34, Thomas carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who'd learned to shoulder life's burdens alone. His calloused hands gripped the reins with practiced ease, though his grey eyes held a distant sadness that seemed permanently etched there. 2 years had passed since cholera had taken his wife Mary and their unborn child, yet the pain remained as fresh as morning frost. As the wagon rounded a bend near Miller's Creek, Thomas spotted something unusual by the roadside. A dark shape crumpled beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. He pulled back on the reins, bringing the horses to a halt, and climbed down to investigate. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. A young woman lay unconscious in the dust, her long auburn hair matted with dirt and sweat. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, now torn and stained from travel. But what struck Thomas most was her condition. She was heavily pregnant, her belly round and full beneath the faded fabric. "Ma'am?" Thomas knelt beside her, gently shaking her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. When she opened her eyes, Thomas found himself looking into the deepest brown eyes he'd ever seen, eyes filled with confusion and fear. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "You're safe now," Thomas said softly. "You're about 3 miles outside Cedar Ridge. I'm Thomas Whitmore. What's your name?" The woman's brow furrowed as she struggled to focus. She pressed a hand to her forehead, wincing. I can't remember." Thomas felt his heart clench. The desperation in her voice reminded him of a wounded animal he'd once found in the woods, lost and afraid, needing shelter and care. "Easy now. Don't strain yourself. Can you tell me how you got here?" She shook her head weakly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Everything's blank. I remember walking, being so tired, but before that—" She trailed off, her hand moving protectively to her swollen belly. "The baby. Is the baby all right?" "From what I can see, you both seem fine, but we need to get you to town. Doc Harrison should take a look at you." Thomas stood and walked back to his wagon, rearranging the lumber to make space. "Think you can manage to sit up?" With Thomas's help, the woman struggled to her feet. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler upbringing than most frontier women. Her dress, despite its current state, had been well made originally. "Thank you," she said as Thomas helped her into the wagon. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." As they continued towards Cedar Ridge, Thomas stole glances at his passenger. She sat quietly, one hand resting on her belly, staring at the passing landscape with a mixture of wonder and worry. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the first evening stars were beginning to appear. "Mr. Whitmore," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "if I can't remember my name, what should people call me?" Thomas considered this for a moment. There was something about her, a quiet dignity despite her circumstances, that reminded him of the Grace his mother had always spoken of, the kind that came from within. "Grace," he said finally. "We'll call you Grace if that suits you." A small smile crossed her lips for the first time since he'd found her. "Grace? Yes, I think I like that." As they approached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Thomas felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. This woman, this Grace, needed help, and perhaps in helping her, he might find a way to heal some of his own wounds. The town's lamplights were beginning to flicker on as they rolled down Main Street, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled out into the evening air, past Murphy's General Store with its painted sign creaking in the breeze. Thomas pulled up in front of Doc Harrison's office, where a warm yellow glow emanated from the windows. "Here we are," Thomas said, climbing down to help Grace from the wagon. "Doc Harrison's been delivering babies and patching up folks in this town for near on 20 years. If anyone can help you, it's him." As Grace took his offered hand, Thomas felt the weight of an unspoken responsibility settling on his shoulders. Whatever had brought this woman to his path, he knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 2. The Doctor's Verdict, Dr. Gu. Ezra Harrison was a thin, methodical man in his 50s, who approached medicine with the same careful precision, He'd once applied to his former profession as a clockmaker back in Philadelphia. His small office, with its shelves lined with glass bottles and medical texts, smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. The examination room, though modest, was kept meticulously clean, a rarity on the frontier that had saved more lives than most folks realized. "Well now, let's see what we have here," Dr. Harrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as Thomas helped Grace onto the examination table. The doctor's voice carried the refined accent of an educated Eastern man, though 20 years in Montana had softened its edges. Thomas retreated to the waiting area, pacing nervously between the wooden chairs. Through the thin walls, he could hear the murmur of voices, the doctor's questions, Grace's hesitant responses. The uncertainty in her voice made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Harrison emerged, wiping his hands on a clean towel. His expression was thoughtful, but not alarmed, which Thomas took as a good sign. "The young lady and her child appear to be in good health considering the circumstances," the doctor said, settling into his desk chair. "She's perhaps 7.5 months along, maybe 8. The baby's positioned well and I can hear a strong heartbeat." "What about her memory?" Thomas asked, leaning forward in his chair. Dr. Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "That's more troubling. She shows signs of exhaustion and dehydration, which could explain some confusion, but the complete memory loss suggests something more significant. Could be from a blow to the head, severe emotional trauma, or sometimes—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes the mind protects itself by forgetting things too painful to remember." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "You think someone hurt her?" "I can't say for certain. There are no obvious signs of physical violence, but that doesn't mean much. What I can tell you is that she's been traveling for some time. Her feet show evidence of long walking, and she's lost more weight than is healthy for a woman in her condition." "Can you do anything for her memory?" "Time and rest are the best medicine for now. Sometimes memories return gradually, sometimes all at once, and sometimes—" Dr. Harrison spread his hands. "Sometimes they don't return at all. The important thing is keeping her and the baby safe until delivery." Grace appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but steadily. She'd washed her face and hands, and Dr. Harrison's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had helped her pin up her hair. The simple act made her look younger and more vulnerable. "What did the doctor say?" she asked, her dark eyes moving between the two men. "You and the baby are doing well," Thomas said gently. "That's what matters most right now." Dr. Harrison stood, professional concern evident in his manner. "Miss Grace, you need proper rest, regular meals, and a safe place to stay. The next few weeks are crucial for both you and your child." Grace's hand moved to her belly, and Thomas saw fear flicker across her features. I don't have anywhere to go. I don't even know if I have family somewhere looking for me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas found himself speaking before he'd fully thought through what he was saying. "You can stay at my place." Both Grace and Dr. Harrison looked at him in surprise. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks but pressed on. "I mean, temporarily. Until you get your bearings or your memory comes back. I've got a spare room and it's quiet out there, good for recovering." "Mr. Whitmore, I couldn't impose—" Grace began. "It's no imposition," Thomas interrupted, though his heart was racing. What was he doing? He barely knew this woman, yet something deep inside him rebelled at the thought of her facing this alone. "The cabin's got everything you'd need, and I'm usually working during the day anyway. You'd have privacy." Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. "That's very generous, Thomas, but there are proprieties to consider. An unmarried woman staying with a bachelor." "I know how it looks, Doc," Thomas said, his jaw setting in the stubborn line that Mary used to tease him about. "But she needs help and I can provide it. Anyone in town has something to say about that can take it up with me directly." Grace looked between the two men, her expression cycling through gratitude, worry, and something that might have been hope. "Are you certain? I don't want to cause you any trouble." Thomas met her eyes, and in them he saw an echo of his own loneliness, the particular isolation that came from having lost everything that mattered. "No trouble at all. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "the place could use a woman's touch. My housekeeping's not what it used to be." Dr. Harrison sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with Thomas when his mind was made up. "Very well, but I want to see you weekly, Miss Grace, until the baby comes. And if there are any complications, any pain, bleeding, or if your memory starts returning in ways that distress you, you send for me immediately." "I will," Grace promised. As they prepared to leave, Grace touched Thomas's arm gently. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Thomas looked out the window at the darkening street, where a few late shoppers hurried past with their parcels. How could he explain that helping her felt like the first meaningful thing he'd done since Mary died? That her need gave him something to focus on besides his own grief? "Let's just say I know what it's like to feel lost," he said finally. "Sometimes we all need someone to open a door." Outside, the evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of a harmonica playing a melancholy tune. As Thomas helped Grace back into the wagon, he caught sight of Mrs. Abernathy peering at them from behind her lace curtains across the street. By tomorrow morning, half the town would know about the mysterious pregnant woman staying at the Whitmore place. Thomas found he didn't care. For the first time in 2 years, he had something more important to worry about than what the neighbors thought. Chapter 3. The Whitmore Cabin. The ride to Thomas's cabin took them 3 miles northwest of Cedar Ridge, following a winding dirt path that cut through dense stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, painted silver by moonlight and shadow. Grace sat quietly beside Thomas, her hands folded over her belly, taking in the vast silence that seemed to swallow the sound of the wagon wheels. "It's so quiet," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the creaking leather and the soft snorting of the horses. "Takes some getting used to if you're not born to it," Thomas replied, "but I find it peaceful. Out here a man can think." The cabin appeared gradually through the trees, a solid structure built from local timber, with a stone chimney already sending a thin wisp of smoke into the night air. Thomas had left a fire banked in the hearth before heading to town that morning, a habit ingrained by years of bachelor living. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and Grace could make out the shadowy outline of stacked firewood and various tools. "It's lovely," Grace said, as Thomas helped her down from the wagon. "You built this yourself?" "Mary and I did, mostly. Took us the better part of 2 summers. Thomas's voice caught slightly on his wife's name, and Grace noticed the way his shoulders tensed. She had strong opinions about how everything should be laid out. The interior of the cabin was simple but well crafted. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Handmade furniture, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth, spoke of careful craftsmanship. Everything was clean, but carried the indefinable air of a home where only one person now lived. "The spare room is through here," Thomas said, lighting an oil lamp and leading Grace down a short hallway. He pushed open a door to reveal a small but comfortable room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a single window facing east. "Mary used this as her sewing room. I haven't changed anything." Grace stepped inside, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the dresser. Folded neatly in one corner was what looked like the beginning of a baby's quilt, delicate stitching in soft yellows and greens. Her breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. "Mr. Whitmore, I can't take this room. It has too many memories." Thomas stood in the doorway, his face shadowed. "Mary would have wanted it used for its intended purpose. She always said this room was meant for a nursery someday." He paused, his voice growing rough. "Maybe it still can be." That night, Grace lay in the narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the settling creaks of the cabin itself. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of her unborn child. The baby seemed active tonight, pressing against her ribs as if responding to the day's upheavals. Grace found herself talking softly to the child, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who we are, little one," she murmured. "I don't know where we came from or where we're supposed to be, but we're safe tonight, and that's something." Through the thin walls she could hear Thomas moving about the main room, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of boots being removed, the banking of the fire. She wondered what thoughts kept him awake, what memories haunted a man who had lost everything he'd built with his wife. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through the window, revealing the room's details more clearly. The unfinished quilt was indeed beautiful, tiny, perfect stitches forming patterns of flowers and vines. On the dresser sat a small wooden box, and Grace found herself drawn to it, despite knowing she shouldn't pry. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were baby clothes, impossibly small gowns and blankets never worn. The sight brought tears to Grace's eyes as she finally understood the full weight of Thomas's loss. "Morning," Thomas called from the kitchen. "Hope you slept well." Grace quickly closed the box and made her way to the main room. Thomas stood at the stove, his back to her, stirring something in a cast-iron pan. He'd already been up for hours. She could tell by the way his hair was damp from washing and his clothes were fresh. "I slept better than I have well, I can't remember how long," Grace said, settling carefully into one of the chairs at the table. "But then again, I suppose that's not saying much." Thomas smiled at her attempt at humor, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Coffee. Mrs. Chen sent along some herbs she said would be good for you." As they ate breakfast, Grace found herself studying Thomas's face. He was handsome in a weathered frontier way. Strong jaw, kind eyes, hands that spoke of honest work. But there was a sadness about him that seemed bone deep, the kind that came from losses too great to fully heal. "Tell me about your work," Grace said, trying to fill the comfortable silence. "You're a lumberjack?" "Own a small operation. Nothing fancy. I cut timber for the mill in town, some custom work for folks building houses or barns. It's honest work, and the forest has been good to me." Thomas paused, looking out the window toward the tree line. "Mary used to say I talked to the trees more than I talked to people. Was she right?" "Usually." Thomas's smile turned rueful. "Trees don't ask difficult questions or expect answers a man doesn't have." Grace felt a flutter in her belly, the baby responding to her laughter. The movement was strong enough that she gasped softly, her hand going to her side. "You all right?" Thomas asked, immediately alert. "Yes, just, the baby's very active this morning." Grace rubbed the spot where a tiny foot or elbow had pressed against her ribs. "It's like he knows we're somewhere new." "He? I don't know why, but I keep thinking it's a boy." Grace's expression grew distant. "Sometimes I feel like I should know things about this baby, important things, but it's all just fog." Thomas reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and calloused, infinitely reassuring. "Don't push so hard," he said gently. "Doc Harrison said your memory might come back on its own. In the meantime, you're safe here. That's what matters." After breakfast, Thomas showed Grace around the property. Behind the cabin was a well-tended vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, but still producing late squash and root vegetables. A small barn housed his horses and equipment, and beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly. "It's beautiful," Grace said, wrapping the shawl Mrs. Chen had given her more tightly around her shoulders. The October air carried a bite that promised an early winter. "So peaceful. I think I could be happy in a place like this." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thomas looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Mary felt the same way when we first came here," he said quietly. "She said it was like living inside a fairy tale." As if summoned by the mention of his late wife, a shadow seemed to fall over Thomas's features. Grace recognized the look, the way grief could ambush a person in the middle of an ordinary moment, turning joy into something complicated and painful. "I should let you get to your work," Grace said diplomatically. "I can manage fine on my own. There's food in the pantry and the well water's good to drink. I'll be back before dark." Thomas hesitated, then added, "Grace, if anyone comes by, anyone at all, you don't have to answer the door. Cedar Ridge is mostly good people, but not everyone takes kindly to unusual situations." As Grace watched Thomas disappear into the forest with his tools, she felt the weight of her isolation settle around her like a heavy cloak. She was alone in a strange place, carrying a child whose father she couldn't remember, dependent on the kindness of a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. Yet somehow, standing in the morning sunlight outside the little cabin, she felt more hopeful than afraid. Whatever had brought her to this place, whatever had erased her past, she was alive and safe. For now, that had to be enough. Chapter 4. Rumors and Revelations. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that surprised Grace with its comfort. Each morning, Thomas would leave for the forest after a quiet breakfast together, and Grace would spend her days resting, reading from Mary's small collection of books, and slowly growing stronger. Her belly had grown noticeably rounder, and Dr. Harrison's weekly visits confirmed that both she and the baby were thriving. But Cedar Ridge was a small town, and small towns bred gossip like summer-bred mosquitoes. The rumors began quietly enough. Whispered conversations at the general store, speculative glances exchanged after church services. By the third week, They had grown bold enough to reach Grace's ears directly. "Thomas Whitmore's got himself a woman out there," she heard Mrs. Abernathy tell her companion as they passed the cabin during their afternoon walk. "Living in sin, they are, and her heavy with another man's child. It's a scandal, I tell you." Grace, who had been hanging laundry on the line Thomas had strung between two trees, felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She ducked behind a sheet, hoping the women hadn't seen her, but their voices carried clearly in the crisp autumn air. "Mark my words, Ethel, no good will come of it. A decent woman doesn't just appear out of nowhere without a past. There's something unseemly about the whole business." That evening, when Thomas returned from work, Grace was unusually quiet during dinner. She pushed food around her plate, lost in thought, until Thomas finally set down his fork and looked at her directly. "Something's troubling you," he said. It wasn't a question. Grace sighed, setting aside her own utensil. "People are talking about us, about me being here." Thomas's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" "The kind you'd expect. Mrs. Abernathy seems particularly concerned about the state of my moral character." Grace tried to keep her tone light, but hurt leaked through despite her efforts. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I shouldn't be here. I don't want to damage your reputation." "My reputation can handle whatever Cedar Ridge wants to throw at it," Thomas said firmly. "You're not going anywhere. But people will think—" "I don't give a damn what people think." The vehemence in Thomas's voice surprised them both. He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "Grace, in the past 3 weeks I've felt more alive than I have since Mary died. Having you here, having someone to talk to, someone to cook for." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable with his own honesty. Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name, but that made her want to reach across the table and take his hand. "I feel the same way," she admitted quietly. "Whatever my life was before I was lonely. I can feel that much, but here with you I feel like I belong somewhere." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then the baby gave a particularly vigorous kick, and Grace gasped, breaking the spell. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, immediately concerned. "Fine, just—" "Oh!" Grace's eyes widened as she felt something she'd never experienced before, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. That felt different. Thomas was on his feet in an instant. "Different how?" "I don't know. Like a cramp, but stronger." Grace rubbed her belly, waiting to see if the sensation would return. When it didn't, she managed a shaky smile. "Maybe it's nothing." But an hour later, as Grace was preparing for bed, the sensation returned. Stronger this time, radiating from her back around to the front. She gripped the dresser, breathing through the discomfort until it passed. "Thomas," she called, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. He appeared in her doorway immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her call. "What is it?" I think something might be happening with the baby. Could you fetch Dr. Harrison?" Thomas didn't waste time with questions. Within minutes he was saddling his horse, leaving Grace with strict instructions to lie down and try to rest. The ride to town and back would take at least 2 hours, and Grace found herself alone with her fears and the growing certainty that her child was coming earlier than expected. She paced the small room, pausing to breathe through each contraction as they grew stronger and more regular. In the lamplight, Mary's unfinished quilt seemed to glow with gentle promise, and Grace found herself talking to the absent woman as if she were a dear friend. "I don't know how to do this, Mary," she whispered during a brief respite between pains. "I don't know anything about being a mother. I can't even remember if I ever held a baby before." The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, and Grace could have sworn she heard a woman's voice in its whisper, gentle, encouraging, telling her she was stronger than she knew. When Dr. Harrison finally arrived with Thomas close behind, Grace was kneeling beside the bed, gripping the quilt frame as another contraction rolled through her. "Well now, young lady," the doctor said, setting down his bag and rolling up his sleeves, "it seems your little one has decided not to wait for a formal invitation." "Is it too early?" Grace asked, worry etching lines around her eyes. "A bit, but not dangerously so. Babies come when they're ready, not when we expect them to." Dr. Harrison's matter-of-fact tone was reassuring. "Thomas, I'll need hot water, clean towels, and that bottle of whiskey you keep in the kitchen cabinet." "I don't drink," Thomas began. "It's not for drinking, son. Now go." As Thomas hurried to gather the requested items, Dr. Harrison turned his attention to Grace. "How long have the pains been coming?" "About 3 hours. They're getting stronger." "That's normal. Your body knows what to do, even if your mind can't remember. The doctor's weathered hands were gentle as he examined her. The baby's positioned well. We might have a long night ahead of us, but I don't foresee any complications. Through the long hours that followed, Thomas remained just outside the bedroom door, pacing like a caged wolf. Every sound from within, Grace's labored breathing, the doctor's quiet instructions, the occasional cry of pain, made his chest tighten with an emotion he was afraid to name. As dawn began to lighten the windows, Grace's voice rose in a final, triumphant cry, followed immediately by another sound that made Thomas's heart stop. The thin, indignant wail of a newborn baby. "Thomas!" Dr. Harrison called. "Come meet the newest resident of Cedar Ridge." Thomas entered the room to find Grace propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Mary's carefully saved blankets. The baby, impossibly small and perfect, had stopped crying and was making soft, snuffling sounds. "It's a boy," Grace said, looking up at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. "A perfect, beautiful boy." Thomas approached slowly, as if walking through a dream. When Grace held out the bundle, he took it with hands that trembled slightly, marveling at the weight of this new life. The baby opened his eyes, dark like his mother's, and seemed to focus on Thomas's face. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Thomas's chest, like tumblers falling into place in a lock he hadn't known was closed. "He's beautiful, Grace," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just perfect." As the morning sun filled the room with golden light, Thomas realized that whatever had brought Grace to his path, whatever forces had led to this moment, he was grateful beyond words. The baby in his arms wasn't his by blood, but as he looked into those dark, trusting eyes, he knew that sometimes the most important bonds weren't born. They were chosen. Outside, Cedar Ridge was waking up to another ordinary day, unaware that in a small cabin in the woods, a new family had just been born. Chapter 5. The Memory Returns. Winter had settled over Montana territory with unusual gentleness, as if the land itself wanted to protect the new life that had come into the world. Baby Samuel, for that was the name Grace had chosen, feeling it suited his serious expression and steady gaze, was now 6 weeks old and thriving under the careful attention of his makeshift family. Thomas had surprised himself with how naturally he'd taken to caring for the infant. He would rise in the night when Samuel cried, walking the floor of the cabin and humming old logging songs until the baby settled back to sleep. During the day, he found excuses to cut timber closer to home, always within earshot, should Grace need help. The gossip in Cedar Ridge had reached a fever pitch after Samuel's birth, but Thomas had discovered that his happiness made him immune to wagging tongues. When Sheriff Morrison had stopped by, "Just checking on folks," he'd said with obvious discomfort, Thomas had invited him in for coffee and introduced him to Samuel with such obvious pride that the lawman had left looking thoroughly confused about what, if any, scandal he was supposed to be investigating. But on this particular December morning, as snow began to fall in lazy flakes outside the cabin windows, everything was about to change. Grace was nursing Samuel in the rocking chair by the fire when the pain hit her. Not physical, but something far worse. It started as a sharp ache behind her temples, then exploded into a torrent of images and memories that made her cry out in shock. A church wedding, herself in white silk radiant with joy, a man's face, handsome but cold, with pale blue eyes and thin lips. Harsh words spoken in anger. "You're worthless, Elena, just like your father said you'd be." A fist raised in fury. Running through the night, stumbling, falling, the taste of blood in her mouth. "Grace!" Thomas was beside her in an instant, steadying both her and the baby as the memories crashed over her like a violent storm. "Grace, what's wrong?" "I remember," she whispered, her face pale as winter dawn. "Oh God, Thomas, I remember everything." She handed Samuel to Thomas with shaking hands and rose unsteadily to her feet. The room seemed to spin around her as fragments of her past life reassembled themselves into a coherent, devastating picture. "My name isn't Grace," she said, her voice hollow. "It's Elena. Elena Hartwell. I was married to a man named Marcus Hartwell in Denver." Thomas felt his heart sink like a stone dropped in deep water. "Married? I ran away." The words came out in a rush now, as if dam had burst inside her. "He was... Thomas. He was a monster. He beat me, told me I was nothing, that no one would ever want me. When I found out about the baby, I thought, I hoped maybe it would change him, but it only made him worse. Eleanor, Grace, wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. The night I left, he hit me so hard I thought he'd killed the baby. He said he didn't want some sniveling brat ruining his life, that he'd make sure I lost it one way or another. Thomas's hands tightened protectively around Samuel, who slept peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding around him. So you ran. I took what little money I had hidden and ran. I walked for days, hiding during daylight, terrified he'd come after me. I must have hit my head when I collapsed by the road. That's why I couldn't remember. Elena's dark eyes filled with tears. But now it's all back, every horrible detail. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stared into the fire, processing what he'd just learned. The woman he'd come to care for, to love if he was honest with himself, was married to another man. The child he'd helped bring into the world, whom he'd already begun to think of as his own son, belonged to someone else. Thomas, Eleanor said softly, I need to tell you something else, something important. He looked up, dreading what she might say next. Marcus isn't Samuel's father. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas felt his breath catch. What? Samuel's father was a good man, a doctor named William Chase who worked at the hospital where I volunteered. We fell in love, but he was already engaged to someone else, someone his family had chosen. When I found out about the baby, I couldn't tell him. I couldn't ruin his life. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the falling snow. Marcus married me for my father's business connections. I thought I could learn to be content, but he was cruel from the very beginning. When I started showing, I told him the baby was premature. He believed it because he wanted to believe it. It meant he could claim the child as his heir without anyone questioning the timing. Thomas rose from the chair, still holding Samuel, and joined her at the window. Does this William Chase know about Samuel? No, and he never can. Eleanor's voice was firm with resolve. He has his own life now, probably children of his own. I won't disrupt that. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the snow fall. Finally, Thomas spoke. What do you want to do now? Now that you remember? Eleanor turned to face him, and Thomas saw a strength in her eyes that had been growing over the months but was now fully revealed. I want to stay here, with you, if you'll have us. Elena, I know it's complicated. I know people will talk even more than they already do. She reached out and touched Samuel's tiny fist, where it emerged from his blanket. But Marcus will never think to look for me here. As far as he knows, Elena Hartwell disappeared without a trace. Grace, the woman you found by the road, she can stay disappeared too. Thomas felt his heart hammer against his ribs. What about legally? You're still married to him. In the eyes of the law, maybe. But in every way that matters, that marriage died the first time he raised his hand to me. Elena's voice grew stronger with each word. I won't go back to that life, Thomas. I'd rather face whatever scandal staying here might bring than spend one more day as Marcus Hartwell's wife. Samuel stirred in Thomas's arms, making the soft sounds that meant he would wake soon and want to be fed. The baby's presence seemed to ground them both, reminding them of what was truly important. There's something I need to tell you too, Thomas said quietly. I love you, Elena. I love both of you. I have for weeks now, but I didn't think I had the right to say it. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you helped me into your wagon. Thomas shifted Samuel to one arm and reached out to cup Elena's face with his free hand. Then we'll figure out the rest as we go, together. That afternoon, Thomas rode into Cedar Ridge to speak with Sheriff Morrison and Judge Patterson about Elena's situation. The legal complexities were daunting. A woman fleeing an abusive marriage, a child of uncertain parentage, the question of what constituted abandonment versus legitimate escape from danger. But when Thomas returned that evening, he brought good news. Judge Patterson, a practical man who'd seen enough frontier hardship to understand that law and justice didn't always align perfectly, had agreed to look into the matter. If Marcus Hartwell made no effort to find his missing wife within a reasonable time, and if there was evidence of abuse, the judge might be willing to declare the marriage dissolved. It won't be quick or simple, Thomas warned Elena as they sat together by the fire, Samuel sleeping between them in a basket Thomas had woven from pine needles and lined with scraps of Mary's fabric. But Patterson's a fair man. He understands that sometimes people need a second chance. "I'm not afraid of waiting," Eleanor said, reaching across to take Thomas's hand. "I'm not afraid of anything anymore, as long as we're together." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Montana wilderness in pristine white. Inside the small cabin, three people who had found each other against all odds settled into the quiet rhythm of evening. Thomas reading aloud from the newspaper, Eleanor mending a shirt by lamplight, Samuel sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle. They were not yet a family in the eyes of the law, but in every way that mattered to the human heart, they had become something stronger than blood relations or legal documents could define. They had become a choice, a daily decision to love and protect and cherish each other, no matter what challenges the world might bring. As the fire burned down to embers, and the cabin filled with the peaceful sounds of contentment, Eleanor looked around at this life she had stumbled into by accident and claimed by design. She thought of the frightened, broken woman who had collapsed by the roadside months ago and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be gossip, legal complications, the ever-present fear that Marcus might somehow track her down. But tonight, in this warm cabin surrounded by snow and silence, Elena Grace Hartwell was exactly where she belonged. And in the basket beside them, Samuel slept the deep, trusting sleep of a child who had never known anything but love, a gift more precious than any inheritance his absent father's name might have provided. The story of the woman who lived pregnant and nameless had found its ending, but the story of the family that chose each other had only just begun.